There are certain chemicals in certain sunscreens that are of concern.
If we're collecting it there, we may be collecting it up here. Minerals basically shield the skin like armor.
Another call for the mineral-based sunscreens, just as a why take the risk?
I myself take a product called sun powder. Out came retinols, which is the inactive version. That's how cosmeceutical companies can get away with prescribing this for people of childbearing age.
Okay, we're doing it. This has been one of my most requested videos, reacting to the Huberman skincare episodes. A little while back, Dr. Andrew Huberman, a Stanford neuroscientist with a massive podcast, he released an episode called How to Improve Skin Health and Appearance. It had a bunch of kind of weird recommendations if you're familiar with skincare science. Then 1.5 months later, he released another skin episode, this time with a dermatologist and skin cancer surgeon, Dr. Soleymani. And a lot of the recommendations started making a bit more sense to me, but not necessarily in a good way. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Michelle. My PhD was in medicinal and supramolecular chemistry. I've been talking about skincare science online since 2011, so I am a bit of a dinosaur in internet years. I also got a cosmetic chemistry diploma in 2021. Huberman Lab episodes are really long in total. These 2 episodes are 5 hours and 14 minutes. So in Lord of the Rings units, that is the whole of the first movie and almost to the end of the second movie, just 2 minutes before Gimli says, "Toss me." So I am not going to be doing a full reaction video. I do not have the energy for that. A lot of the topics are repeated in both episodes, their style is pretty wordy, and I prefer to be more concise. I'm going to tackle it by topic to make this more digestible, which means I am going to be showing edited clips from the episodes. I have tried my best to capture the gist of what they're saying. I'll be showing the wider context as well, but this video is much shorter than 5 hours, so I had to be selective. Stuff did get cut out. Before we keep going, I want to say I didn't really have strong feelings either way about Huberman or the dermatologist before seeing what they said about skincare and interacting with them online. I'm not like a Huberman hater, but bad advice in my specialty area does really annoy me because I have followed bad skincare advice. I used to be a moderator on the skincare addiction subreddit, so I have also seen lots of other people following bad advice. And it is just such a waste of time and money. There's already so much BS surrounding skincare, and I just don't think we need scientists adding to that. A lot of the stuff in the episodes is largely correct. I'm not going to nitpick little errors too much because people do say the wrong word when they're speaking off the cuff. I do it all the time. I'm going to focus on the big issues and the recommendations, which is really where I think everything goes kind of pear-shaped. Starting with sun protection, this is probably the most controversial topic here. It is the one that people keep asking me about. Australian, skincare, highly pigment-prone genetics. I talk about sunscreen a lot.
There is clear evidence that sunlight can cause skin cancers. I want to highlight the fact that there's very little controversy as to whether or not UV light can cause mutations in cells. I am not what is called a sunscreen truther, okay? I'm not somebody who thinks that sunscreen has no value. In fact, quite the opposite under certain conditions and certain sunscreens. I want to say that for the record.
Sunscreen was how I first came across Andrew Huberman. There was this viral clip of him that I broke down in a different video. That one led to a lot of people saying, well, Huberman doesn't recommend sunscreen. He is a Stanford professor. He has a massive following. Therefore, none of us should wear sunscreen. So I do really appreciate him being so clear and upfront about addressing this in this episode. Thank you. I know we kind of think of skin cancer as just no big deal. You just have to cut out a chunk of skin and then you're good to go. But I recently watched a documentary that's called Conquering Skin Cancer. It was just super eye-opening. Some people then have to get treatment every 2 weeks for the rest of their lives. Some of it was really gory, so I'm going to link it below if you're into that. One woman had to get an eyebrow removed twice. Her cheek also got removed, and then they had to rotate a piece of her neck skin and graft it onto her cheek, and then she had to reprogram her brain into sensing that that was actually her cheek and not her neck. The skin cancer also got into one guy's lymph node, which then burst and just spread the cancer into his blood. It's just not always something that you can just easily brush off.
Many people believe that if they didn't get a sunburn, they are not at additional risk for inducing skin cancer or other issues with skin, right? We're not just talking about skin cancer, we're talking about accelerated aging of the skin according to sun exposure.
Again, credit to him for saying this. This is a really important message. The evidence is very clear. Intense sun exposure that leads to a sunburn is bad, but intermittent sun exposure here and there also adds up that sun damage is cumulative. In the most famous clinical trial on sunscreen, which was the NAMBA trial, people who wore sunscreen consistently every day ended up with less skin cancers and skin aging than people who wear it like how most people wear sunscreen, so to places like the beach where you're likely to burn. So all of those little exposures, like walking to and from the car, walking to and from the office, those will still add up. Now, that study was done in the 90s with an SPF 16 sunscreen. It also didn't really look properly photostabilized. So these days, the sunscreens we have now, they are going to make a bigger difference. But the problems are really with the specifics of sun protection and sunscreens, and the misunderstandings here are pretty widespread, even with medical doctors and dermatologists, as well as scientists who aren't quite as familiar with this area. And all of this is going to get a lot worse over the next few years because US regulations are just kind of ass backwards about this, so we may as well discuss it now. Before he goes into sunscreen, he talks about physical barriers as an alternative for people who might be worried about chemicals.
If you're just one of these people that does not want to put sunscreen on because you're very concerned about whatever chemical, the physical barrier of an article of clothing or a hat or a bandana can indeed shield you from the sun, often to a great degree. I don't think there's any controversy as to whether or not those are safe.
He brings up physical barriers a bunch in both episodes.
Maybe for the moment, let's just set aside sunscreens and acknowledge that a physical barrier like hat, long sleeves, long pants provides a pretty good barrier to the sun, correct?
Yeah. In fact, physical barriers like shade, clothing, hats have been shown to be more effective than topical sunscreens for several reasons.
Another call for the mineral-based sunscreens just as a, why take the risk?
Or even, shade, hat, clothing. If you're really worried about putting something on and absorption, you get excellent protection by actual barriers.
It's also in one of the 2 Instagram posts he used to promote this episode. No one debates a physical barrier. And I kind of get it. You want to give people a solution if they're never going to wear sunscreen anyway, but the problem is, if it gets presented like this, like it's an easy alternative with 0 downsides, a lot of people are going to go for the easy alternative with 0 downsides because they don't know any of the limitations of physical barriers, which are not raised in these episodes. I don't know if they're aware how big some of these downsides are. I certainly didn't before I looked into the research properly, and I think if they did and they also realize how safe sunscreens actually are, which we will definitely get to.
Are we collecting it in our adipose tissue? If we're collecting it there, we may be collecting it up here.
That sort of cost-benefit calculus that you do when you're trying to decide what to do, that would be different, and maybe they wouldn't have leaned into this whole physical barrier thing quite as much. Let's talk about hats and shade. They are great, but they are also kind of deceptive. I think we kind of assume that if we're in the shade, we're protected, but that's not actually true. So if it's sunny, for example, we can still see stuff in the shade, and that's because visible light isn't just coming from the sun. Light is also being scattered, it's bouncing off air molecules in the sky onto things that are in the shade. It is a lot darker in the shade than in the sun, but there is still light bouncing off those objects into our eyes. That is how we see things. But it's way worse for UV. UV scatters a lot more, and UVB, which are the short wavelengths that cause more damage, they scatter about 10 times more than visible light. So as an extremely rough approximation, the amount of UV damage that you're getting in the shade is going to be roughly 10 times more than you would expect if you're just judging it based on what you're seeing, how dark it is. And that is why, if you're wondering, that's why you get burned in the shade. You just have UV bouncing off other things, the sky, other objects, onto you. A good way of estimating how much of this scattered UV you're getting is sky view. Basically, if you're standing in the middle of a field, very roughly, about 40% of the UV you're getting is from the sun shining directly on you, and 60% is from the sky molecules bouncing that UV onto you, that's scattering. The exact percentages will depend on things like latitude and wavelength, but the key takeaway here is the sunlight that's directly shining on you can be less than half of the total UV that you're getting, which is honestly, I think, quite mind-blowing. For the 60-ish% of scattered UV you're getting from the sky, the amount is proportional to the amount of sky you see. So if you're in the middle of a field, you are seeing 100% of the inside of basically a big blue dome of sky. If you're completely in the shade under like a tiny umbrella that just blocks out the sun, there is 0 sunshine directly hitting your skin, but you are still getting 60% of the total UV. If you're standing right next to a building and you are completely in the shade, you've blocked out about half the sky, so that means you are getting about 30%. So that means even though you are in the shade and you're right next to a building, you are still getting about a third of the UV that you are getting in the middle of a completely empty, no shade field. That is a lot. And this will be extra deceptive because when you're in the shade next to the building, you're not going to be anywhere near as hot as in the middle of that sunny field. And there's also UV being scattered from the ground and surfaces around you as well as from the sky. That means hats are actually way less protective than you'd expect. One study looked at an Akuba drover, which looks like this, except this one is from the Cancer Council. Over a year, the forehead UV, so around here, was reduced to 1/7, which makes sense, it's closer to the shade, it's seeing less sky, but nose UV was still 1/3. The cheek, though, was getting more than half of the UV compared to zero hat. And that fraction is how SPF works, so on average, the hat was only giving SPF 2 to 6. And that is pretty low compared to a sunscreen, and I mean, this is a pretty big hat. It's not like a small baseball cap, which I think is what most people are thinking of when they're talking about hats. Next, clothing and fabric. It's also great, but again, limitations. The main one is that when UV is high, it's usually really hot, and the sorts of natural, light-colored, airy fabrics that you actually want to wear, they don't block out much UV. There's been a bunch of studies, this is just one example, about 2/3 of the white fabrics that they tested had less than UPF 15, which is kind of like the equivalent of SPF. I have more detailed videos on clothes and hats, and of course sunscreen also has downsides. You use it up much faster than hats or clothing, you also need to reapply, and people skip spots, and they often don't apply enough. So it really shouldn't be hats versus clothing versus sunscreen, it's really hats plus clothing plus sunscreen plus shade and sunglasses. And this is the messaging that's been used in Australia kind of forever. It is slip, slop, slap, seek, slide. I went to a sun protection conference in Queensland recently, that is the skin cancer capital of the world. I actually did a plenary talk. A lot of the really big names in sun protection research were there, and they were really emphasizing this layering Swiss cheese style approach. Onto, I guess, the main course, sunscreen safety.
I do believe in certain sunscreens, meaning I will put sunscreen on certain days, on certain parts of my body. However, I do believe, now having spoken to multiple dermatologists and looked into the literature very deeply, that there are certain chemicals in certain sunscreens that are of concern.
There are a lot of problems here, and the overarching one is really relevant expertise. Huberman is a neuroscientist and he's talked to dermatologists. These are not really suitable scientific backgrounds for understanding sunscreen safety. This seems to really blow a lot of people's minds. A lot of topics related to skincare are not dermatology. Dermatologists are medical doctors. Dermatology is mostly about skin disease, and it is much more complicated than you might think from seeing what dermatologists talk about on social media and in news articles. Their training has a lot of more serious medical things to cover, things that they actually need for being a practicing dermatologist. There isn't that much extra time to cover what moisturizer ingredients do, which is a whole thing that we are going to get to later.
And then there's lotions, which are generally powders that are resuspended with water.
Or how shampoo works, which is another whole thing.
We've taken that artificial oil coating that replaced the cuticle and washed it off.
Or this one, ingredient safety. Ingredient safety is a massive topic. It is the expertise of a whole different set of experts, and the main ones are safety assessors who are usually regulatory toxicologists. A lot of them have backgrounds as pharmacists or dermatologists or chemists or even vets because there are animal studies involved. But risk assessment is a very narrow specialty within these fields. They generally have higher degrees that are specific to toxicology, so a greater level of formal education. Most pharmacists, dermatologists, etc. probably don't know this process exists. Definitely most chemists don't. Sunscreens are regulated as drugs in multiple countries, the US, Australia, Canada, which means that they go through a stringent approval process. Those individual sunscreen ingredients get assessed for safety by regulatory toxicology panels. These are panels of experts whose whole job it is to look at safety. And these safety assessments generally don't get published in the peer-reviewed literature. They are essentially government reports. They have a different purpose. They're not meant to spread new research. They are very specialized reviews. In a lot of other regions, the EU, Korea, Canada, Brazil, sunscreens are a special category of cosmetics and they get more scrutiny. So again, we have lots of official safety assessments. These safety assessments, they do look at peer-reviewed studies, but also a lot of data that isn't published in scientific journals. And when I'm saying look at studies, this isn't just reading through them. I'm sure Huberman thinks he did look into the literature very deeply, but in a safety assessment, toxicologists aren't just reading the study. They are choosing specific data points out of that based on criteria. They're assessing whether or not they're reliable enough to use, and then they take them and do specific calculations with them. They plug them into toxicological models. These models are essentially algorithms to predict what is actually safe. So this is a whole different level of interpretation because toxicologists or regulatory toxicologists, their entire job is sifting through these sorts of studies and interpreting them and then putting them into these calculations. My friend Jen made this chart on who is the right expert for different topics. She is a cosmetic scientist. She interviews different cosmetic experts on her podcast, and it's just really good for learning what different experts do within cosmetic science. And this isn't me like dissing dermatologists or anything, this is just straight up reality. You cannot be an expert in everything because expertise actually takes a lot of time. It already takes over 10 years to become a dermatologist. If you want to be a safety assessor, you first off need a relevant degree like toxicology or pharmacy or medicine, and then most of them will also have a relevant master's or PhD. Then there's professional training on how to do safety assessments in your region, so we're talking maybe 7 to 10 years. Now, I'm sure there are some people out there who have done both, but the reality is the vast majority of dermatologists are not experts in regulatory toxicology and vice versa. I tried to raise this issue in a comment on Huberman's Instagram post, so maybe he would consider looking at other sources before talking more about sunscreen safety. But he seemed pretty convinced that his Harvard-trained derm expert in oncology would be fine. Small clarification here, I don't think he hid my comment. Random words will just trigger Instagram's automatic filters. I think it got automatically filtered. And then a month after this, we got the second episode, which had the dermatologist who specialized in surgery, Dr. Soleymani, saying things that matched what the first episode had. So I'm guessing he was the main source. From what I can tell, he went to Stanford, not Harvard, so I don't know if this was him or a different dermatologist. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we need to gatekeep or that experts have to stay strictly within their lanes and never talk about anything else. I mean, my background is medicinal and supramolecular chemistry. I was just talking about UV scattering, which is mostly physics. I am about to talk about toxicology, which is adjacent to medicinal chemistry. There is a lot of overlap, but they are not one and the same. Most topics involve more than one expertise, and communicating science clearly and accurately is itself a lane. But the further you go outside of your lane, the more you need to really carefully check if your understanding is correct. And that means checking what the most relevant experts are saying and knowing who the most relevant experts are. The problem is you don't know what you don't know, and a lot of people, including a lot of dermatologists and scientists, they don't know that these regulatory processes are ticking over in the background, making sure that consumer products, like sunscreens, are actually safe. In the first episode, Huberman has a 10-minute section about chemical sunscreens.
When it comes to chemical-based sunscreens, personally, I avoid them.
I'm not going to play the whole 10 minutes, obviously, but the main gist is pretty much what this post says. Mineral sunscreens are safe. Chemical sunscreen safety is debated.
But there are these concerns about some of those chemical components as endocrine disruptors and potentially as mutagens. You can find all sorts of concerns out there on the internet. Most of those concerns are not substantiated, but these chemicals can be problematic at high concentrations.
The dermatologist goes into more detail in that second episode. He starts off by saying that he tends to only recommend mineral sunscreens, and he gives his reasons.
In the original set of sunscreens that were approved by the FDA that came out in 1999, there wasn't enough data to look at biologic effects, efficacy, internal organ involvement. Fast forward 20 years, and we've gathered a lot more information about these chemical organic compounds. There is an amazing 2020 study that looked at absorption of chemical sunscreens when they're applied onto the skin. Even with single application, they saw blood plasma absorption of these chemicals that were 100 to 500 times greater than the upper threshold defined by the FDA. Now the question exists, okay, what does that mean? That's still up for debate.
This is a common misunderstanding of what the FDA studies actually mean. I've seen quite a few medical doctors saying something similar, and I think a lot of the confusion comes from the fact that we're not just talking about science, we're also talking about regulations and laws. And regulations and laws don't necessarily reflect the scientific understanding all that well. So here is the background. The FDA published 2 studies on sunscreens absorbing into blood in 2019 and 2020. There were a whole bunch of very scary headlines, as you would expect. Before that, the regulations were assuming that sunscreen ingredients weren't absorbed into blood at very high levels. They were assuming it was lower than half a nanogram per milliliter, which looks like this. This is the so-called upper threshold he was referring to when he said 100 to 500 times greater than the upper threshold. And he also says this.
That 2020 study that showed that we're seeing it in the blood at levels that are 200 to 500 times the upper limit of normal as defined by sunscreen criteria.
This all sounds really scary, but half a nanogram per mil isn't actually the upper limit of normal. It is actually a super low limit. It is low enough that the FDA assumes it is safer by default. This is actually explained in the FDA study that they cited, plasma concentrations that surpass the FDA threshold for potentially waiving some of the additional safety studies for sunscreens. At this lower level, there just aren't that many molecules in your blood, even if it's potentially accumulating inside your body. And other types of data already show that sunscreen molecules are just extremely unlikely to have harmful long-term effects at these very low levels. Now, we can't really say they definitely won't because scientists just hate committing to any sort of extreme concrete stance, but this is a very conservative limit. So ingredients below this level, they don't need more detailed safety studies to get approved by the FDA. Remember, sunscreen is a drug, so you can imagine there's like a complicated flowchart and there's a branch that goes less than or greater than half a nanogram per mil. If it's less than, it means they go down this path. And so originally the sunscreen ingredients went down that path and they were eventually classified as generally recognized as safe and effective, or GRACE. But these 2 studies were a big deal, and that was mostly because the FDA themselves did them, and this meant the FDA was officially recognizing that chemical sunscreens went down the wrong path in the flowchart. They should have gone down the other path, which meant they needed more safety data to actually get that GRACE status. So in 2021, the FDA proposed a new rule that said they needed specific studies both on humans and on animals. There wasn't any reason to do these tests before because everyone thought they didn't need them, so those studies hadn't been done yet, that data doesn't exist. And this doesn't really sound like a huge problem, right? You just have to get this data and then they'll get approved again. Except, again, we have regulations involved. And this is where the fact that sunscreens are cosmetics rather than drugs in other places really comes in, because cosmetics have animal testing bans. In the European Union, animal testing of cosmetics has been progressively banned since 2004, and there's been more bans introduced around the world since then. Now, the ingredient manufacturers who would be doing these studies are selling sunscreen ingredients all over the world, so essentially they have to choose between doing the studies and then getting them reapproved in the US, or they don't do the studies and keep selling them everywhere else. Because of this sort of legal conundrum, there is a decent chance that the US just won't have chemical sunscreens at some point, or maybe they'll just stay in limbo forever. There is more on this whole mess in this sunscreen conference that I co-hosted with Jen.
Now the question exists, okay, what does that mean? Is this healthy? Is this not healthy? Is it neither? That's still up for debate.
So this is pretty much where the official regulatory position in the US has landed us, kind of like, without all this new data, we just will never know if they're safe. But that is not actually the scientific position. That's because in the rest of the world, sunscreen regulations are different. Basically, the flowcharts for approval, the specific data that they need, are just not the same. Side note, this whole regulations not matching science thing is also why US sunscreens don't have those newer chemical filters, the ones that are making European, Asian, Australian sunscreens just so much nicer to use. The rest of the world was recognizing that sunscreens absorb into blood, and they were doing safety assessments based on that knowledge well before 2020, and in fact, there are studies suggesting that sunscreens went above that half a nanogram threshold all the way back in the 1990s. US people aren't built that differently from people in the rest of the world, probably. So this whole idea that no one knows if sunscreens are actually safe is a legal fiction. I mean, we can always use more precision, more data is always better, but that is true with pretty much any field of science. How much we don't know about sunscreen safety is just massively, massively overblown. The EU has been reassessing chemical sunscreens from 2021, and they started with the ones that had the most cause for concern, which was mostly possible endocrine disruption. These are the older chemical sunscreens, and all of the ones that are commonly used in US sunscreens, they have been reassessed as safe. I have a more detailed video going through the EU safety assessment process. I got 3 toxicologists to check over it, including Mo of Mo Skin Lab. He's also a cosmetic safety assessor. He's on YouTube and Instagram. He is fantastic. You should definitely follow him. He's also checked over what I was planning to say in this video, so if I say something wrong, that is probably my fault for going off script. Don't blame him. But here is like the high-level overview. The safety assessors went through all of the hazard data, which is how that ingredient could be potentially harmful. This includes animal and human studies. Based on that, they decided on a dose that is expected to cause little to no harm, and this is called the point of departure. In most assessments so far, this is called the NOAL. Then they went through all of the exposure data, which is how much will actually get into your body. So how easily it goes through your skin, how much you apply, how you apply it. So for example, if you have a spray, they would also look at how much you inhale as well as how much would get absorbed through your skin. Also, if you're likely to apply it in more than one product, so if different products that you use will add up. And generally they go with a high level of use. They're calculating the risk if you use it all over your body every day, which is much more than most people use. So they essentially have 2 values, how much should be okay inside your body and how much actually gets into your body. And then based on those 2, they work out what percentage should be allowed in sunscreen so that you only get 1/100th of the okay amount. So the amount that you should be exposed to when you're applying it to your entire body isn't even the full amount that should cause little to no harm. It is 100 times less. And this is called the margin of safety. Basically, there is a massive buffer. So here's an example. Oxybenzone used to be allowed at 6%, but the EU dropped this to 2.2%. And this kind of sounds like maybe 6% is now bad for you, but that's not actually what they calculated. They calculated that 220% is still not bad for you. And that is with everyday full body application. So this is really just making sunscreen slightly safer, and this sort of adjustment is happening all the time in the background. In Australia, they're working out a new way of doing safety assessments that should be coming out by the end of the year, or so I was told at the conference. So with all of that in mind, this is why this point that they both keep making about how uncertain everything is just isn't really accurate.
Some of that fear is substantiated. When one goes and looks at the studies, the way these studies were done often involves having people apply a ton of these chemical-based sunscreens. A big issue that's not often discussed because it's very difficult to control for in a natural setting is how much sunscreen one is applying and how often across how many years of time. So there's no real prescriptive that can tell you, hey, if you put chemical sunscreens on once, that's problematic.
There's data that suggests that the chemicals are found in breast milk, amniotic fluid, blood plasma, urine. There's a lot of things that we don't know. And I always say this in science, we take 2 steps forward and then maybe 1 step diagonally or sideways because we ran into unexpected things. I tend to recommend mineral sunscreens because they don't have any of that data.
I can see their perspective. If you don't know how these safety assessments work, if you're just looking at peer-reviewed sunscreen studies, it does kind of seem like you have these blood and urine measurements in humans, and then you have mice and zebrafish having all these weird effects after eating tons and tons of sunscreen, and then you also have all these cell studies with changes in response to sunscreen, and so it kind of looks like the real risk is somewhere within this massive range. But the realistic range is way, way smaller because all of these data points are feeding into toxicological models that can make predictions based on how normal people use sunscreens. It's like how no one had ever sent a telescope this big into space before, but because of lots of data points like how heavy it is, how much energy the field gives, it was able to happen. If you're just looking at these data points like individual puzzle pieces, it might look really uncertain, but safety assessors know the big picture and how everything is fitting together. And yes, there are uncertainties, but they are just nowhere near as big as they are making them out to be. So all of this concerning and uncertain data, which places like the EWG tend to really push, if you understand how it feeds into safety assessments, all of this data is actually just really reassuring. I mean, I've never really been that concerned about chemical sunscreens as an Australian, but there was maybe a little bit niggling in the back of my mind. But after properly going through the safety assessments and understanding them, my mind is just really at peace with it. I highly recommend going through them. The dermatologist goes into detail about some of what he found personally concerning.
There's been a lot of basic science, animal study, and retrospective human studies in the last 2 or 3 years that suggest that some of these chemical compounds particularly oxybenzone, particularly octocrylene, particularly octinoxonate, that can have endocrine disruption or affect the nervous system because they mimic a lot of biologic phenolic compounds and a lot of biologic hormones.
So again, all of the sunscreens he mentions, oxybenzone, octocrylene, and I'm guessing he meant octinoxate, their safety has been assessed in other regions and they've been repeatedly found to be safe. Those assessments take into account the studies that he's talking about, but in a lot more detail because that is the safety assessor's job. They also would have looked at lots of other data that he probably, almost definitely hasn't seen before. The EU one specifically looked at endocrine disruption, and they found that the current evidence didn't demonstrate that it's an issue.
Looking at the chemical structure of these compounds, a lot of these are phenolic compounds, meaning they have one or two, usually two benzene rings attached together, and they look very similar to one another.
The stuff he's talking about here with chemical structures and their impacts on the body, that is very much my turf. My PhD was in medicinal chemistry. I also did a lot of pharmacology. What he's talking about are called structure-activity relationships. There is a bit of truth here. The way that a lot of substances have effects on our bodies is by binding to proteins called receptors. So this is kind of like the receptor is a lock and you have our molecule as a key. Keys that have similar shapes can interact with the same lock, but the really, really important thing that he's missing here is that similarly shaped things can have opposite effects at the lock. So it's like one key might fit in and open the lock, another key might actually fit in, get stuck, and jam the lock, and that makes it even harder to open. Here are three molecules. Which two do you think will have a similar effect? Unless you're already familiar with this, you probably pick the top two. They have the same shape, they have that thick line honeycomb thing going on, but the answer is actually the bottom two. So the top one is naloxone, which is also called Narcan. It's essentially a key that fits the opioid receptor really well, but it doesn't activate the lock, it doesn't activate the receptor, it actually blocks the other two out, and that's why it's used for reversing overdoses. So the shapes on their own don't tell you very much. You need to have other data. You need to know whether the molecules are interacting with the receptor in the correct way, and you also need to have enough of those molecules to interact with enough receptors in the first place. You also need to know what else is there inside the body that binds to the same receptor. So with naloxone, that's not going to do much unless you already have other opioids there. And a lot of potential endocrine disruptors actually bind very weakly to hormone receptors. So let's say an estrogen receptor. So in the context of our bodies where we have lots and lots of other things that will interact with that lock, that receptor, much more strongly, for example, all of those different estrogens, these potential endocrine disruptors might not actually be doing any disrupting. And the examples he has here, phenolic and two benzene rings, these are just so general. Benzene rings are the hexagon things, and phenolic doesn't actually mean benzene ring, it is the OH on the ring. Out of the three sunscreens he listed, only oxybenzone is phenolic, but phenolic and two benzene rings just don't mean much biologically. There are tons and tons of things that are phenolic and they have two benzene rings. For example, lots of plant antioxidants, resveratrol, which is that healthy antioxidant that people use as an excuse to drink more red wine, that is phenolic and it has two benzene rings. Benzene rings are really good at absorbing UV though, which is why sunscreens have so many of them. So I'm not really sure how he came up with this. I don't know if he came up with it himself or he read it somewhere. It isn't in the two papers that they cite for sunscreen safety. One of the papers was the FDA study. Another one was a systematic review that was written by two dermatology students and two dermatologists. There's a lot in there that isn't accurate. Another thing they say in there is that oxybenzone and octinoxate damage coral reefs, which I've talked about before. They do not, according to the current evidence. This is from the top coral scientists. This issue that the dose is just too low to have much of an effect is the same for a lot of the other things in these episodes. It's like a running theme. Endocrine disruption, nervous system dysregulation, and this.
They are organic phenolic compounds. They are hydrophobic. They're lipophilic, meaning they can cross membranes very easily. Now we have to scratch our head. Where is this circulating? Where is this going? Are we collecting it in our adipose tissue? If we're collecting it there, we may be collecting it up here.
I don't know if this dermatologist is the original reason why Huberman thought sunscreen collects in the brain. I've talked about that claim before, but this is not how it works. I'm not really entirely sure where this whole lipophilic things go through membranes really easily thing comes from, but there is so much more criteria involved. It's not like once something is oily, it just like goes through stuff. It's just not how it works. Being a medicinal chemist would just be so much easier if that was actually true. And then on top of that, again, the amount actually needs to be high enough to make a difference. If you try to lick a painkiller pill to try to get rid of a headache, that's probably not going to work. We all have a bunch of radioactive uranium inside our bodies, but it's not a problem because the amount is just so tiny. Safety assessments and sunscreen regulations recommend an amount that ends up with you getting much less than a harmful dose.
The FDA's proposed final order in 2021 changed these chemicals from GRACE, generally recognized as safe and effective, to not GRACE because of these concerns.
This is not accurate. First off, it is a proposed order, so it's just meant to tell sunscreen companies they need to give the data. The status only changes in the future when the order gets finalized and it gets called a final order. That's why you can still buy chemical sunscreens in the US if they were actually not GRACE. You would not be able to go to the shops and see them everywhere. Also, the chemical sunscreens he's been talking about will be not GRACE because of lack of data, not because of safety concerns like he says. Some of the really old sunscreen ingredients that no one actually uses anymore are actually proposed to be not GRACE because of safety concerns, but these ones are not, and the FDA makes this distinction super clear everywhere. I actually told Huberman who the right experts were a full month before this, so I was kind of surprised that he still got a dermatologist onto his podcast to come on and answer questions about sunscreen safety really incorrectly, and then millions of people probably heard it and believed it. And of course, there were also all the clips that went up on social media. You'll see a lot of debate online about sunscreen. Some people are concerned about the ingredients in sunscreen. I asked Dr. Soleymani how to select a sunscreen. There is consensus around mineral-based sunscreen being safe. Zinc oxide would be your best bet. I had a bit of a conversation with the dermatologist in the comments, and honestly, I think his comments kind of just prove my point. I agree about letting the public make an informed decision, but this episode is not doing that because he isn't really that informed himself. Now, the alternatives they suggest, of course, mineral sunscreen.
Mineral-based creams and lotions I tend to prefer and recommend in my practice, and most people will if you're worried about any risk, any consequence. Chemicals, I tend to personally avoid. Now, this may not be in line with all my dermatology colleagues, but I tend to avoid them, and I do not recommend them for kids. The 16 most common chemicals that in 99 were everywhere, from spray sunscreens and bottles and things like that, are now being defined as question mark, maybe not safe by the FDA, the very company that regulates it.
Another call for the mineral-based sunscreens, just as a, why take the risk?
I've talked a lot before about why they aren't necessarily a better option, and that's especially if we're also talking about the newer chemical sunscreens that you can't actually get in the US. I posted a bunch of these reasons on that earlier post a month before this came out. 1. Mineral sunscreens with decent SPF have poor cosmetic acceptability, which encourages under-application, the most common cause of sunscreen failure and severe unintentional UV exposure. And he actually mentions this in the podcast too.
If I recommend a brand and you don't like it, it doesn't feel good or smell good, you're never going to use it, and it's a waste of your money and time.
These sensory aspects might sound really superficial, but some of the biggest reasons that people don't wear sunscreen or don't wear enough sunscreen is that they just think it's greasy, it clogs their pores, it's thick and heavy, and it just looks bad. Consumer testing consistently finds that the vast majority of people, they just prefer chemical sunscreens, and they also apply way less mineral sunscreen than they really should. So unless you are really pale or you find a shade that is just perfectly matched to your skin tone, this is what you look like if you apply enough. So most people are not applying enough. You need about a quarter teaspoon for just your face. Sunscreen is like paint. UV is a type of light, so if you don't apply enough paint, the light gets through to the stuff underneath. Mineral ingredients are technically safer, kind of, but only by a little bit because all sunscreens are very safe, and also not applying enough sunscreen is also unsafe. They do come in solid particles. Bigger particles means that they don't get into skin as easily, and even nanoparticles will have a hard time. But this particulate stuff is also why there are a whole bunch of downsides. There is a chemical filter called MBBT, That one is also particulate and it has similar downsides to mineral sunscreens. So we are just talking about fundamental limitations, the laws of physics with solid particles. It's like sandy water versus sugary water. You can feel the particle texture a lot more on your skin with sand, and they can also dry out your skin. Sugary water is just a lot thinner and nicer. In places that aren't as influenced by US marketing, like in mainland Europe, Japan, Korea, there are actually very few mineral-only sunscreens because there just isn't that much of an actual upside. But all of this marketing pressure, which is mostly just unjustified chemophobia, also encourages companies to add unregulated organic additives to mineral sunscreens. These are basically chemical sunscreens, but less regulated. These are SPF boosters. I've talked about them before. They are just chemical sunscreens with a few extra atoms added to them so they don't, I guess, count legally as chemical sunscreens. Having them in the sunscreen means that you don't need as much of the minerals to get the same SPF, which means less whitening, less heaviness, greasiness, and so on. It's like avoiding medications and taking supplements adulterated with the same actives instead, which rationally is less safe, but similarly makes a lot of people feel safer. Scientifically, these boosters are probably similar in safety to chemical sunscreens, but they aren't regulated as tightly, which means, firstly, we don't have anywhere near as many rules about how companies can use them, and we also have way less data on them. They are listed under inactive ingredients, so a lot of people don't actually realize what they are, especially people who are recommending mineral sunscreens as a safer option.
I think we both agree that the mineral-based sunscreens are going to be the best option of the ones out there, if one is at all concerned about some of these chemical components in chemical sunscreens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fair enough?
Absolutely
Okay.
agree.
Will any zinc oxide and or titanium dioxide containing sunscreen, provided there are no chemical components in there, besides the inactive ingredients, of course, will any suffice?
Number one, any brand that is mineral-based is fine.
He mentions broad spectrum, SPF 30, but he has nothing about these boosters. Again, I tried to tell you. I don't think SPF boosters are a big deal. Most people don't actually realize they exist, which is fine because they are likely very safe. They are basically just chemical sunscreens, and those are very safe. And for people who have allergies, they are much more dangerous because it's so much harder to see them. So it's just hypocritical and kind of revealing when people are recommending these as a so-called safer option. They really aren't. And this kind of thing probably wouldn't even be happening if people stopped doing all this avoid chemicals, use minerals stuff. Again, so much of this clean beauty fear-mongering is actually counterproductive. It is making our products less safe. There are also some technical drawbacks as well. The inherent density of mineral particles predisposes mineral sunscreens to separation. I don't know why I went so hard on the long words that day, which is probably why they consistently fail Consumer Reports water resistance testing. Again, like if you have mud in water, if you have dense mineral particles, they want to settle out and clump. The formula is pretty much just fighting the laws of physics to try to keep all of these particles evenly separated. On the other hand, if you have dissolved chemical sunscreens like sugar and water, that is just a much more robust system. And this is extra bad for zinc oxide because it isn't a very efficient filter. So you actually need much more solid particles to get the same SPF. They also talk about how mineral versus chemical sunscreens work. This is from the first episode.
Sunscreens containing zinc oxide and or titanium dioxide were engineered for that specific purpose, to reflect back UV light. This is very different than organic or chemical sunscreens. Chemical sunscreens are designed to absorb UV light. Mineral-based sunscreens, so-called inorganic sunscreens, are designed to reflect back UV light.
A few people told me about this because a lot of people know that this is one of my pet topics, and this is what I wrote. Also, all organic and inorganic sunscreen ingredients both work almost entirely by absorption of UV, not scattering and reflection. So all sunscreens are similarly physical barriers. So the reason that synthetic and dark-colored clothes protect from UV better is because the polymers and the dye molecules have benzene rings, which is exactly like chemical sunscreens. See e.g. my paper, which has prompted the American Academy of Dermatology to update their website's info on sunscreen mechanism of action. I'm pretty proud to have helped this happen. I left the title there as well, just to be extra helpful. And then a month later, in the second episode, how do we think it went?
There's a bit of an online debate about this, claiming that they all absorb UV rays.
Yeah. So historically, it had been thought that mineral or physical sunscreens, zinc, and titanium sunscreens, worked by basically acting as a metal reflecting shield. And
Here's where it goes bad.
for the most part, that thinking is not incorrect. There was a new study that showed that they work by actually absorbing them, but not having any sort of chemical change. So the way chemical organic sunscreens work is they absorb the ultraviolet radiation, they undergo a chemical reaction to reduce its energy and dissipate that energy as heat.
There is a lot to talk about here. First off, the amount that's scattered or reflected is about 5%. 5% is definitely not for the most part. It is 1 in 20. That thinking is actually, for the most part, not correct. The new study that they mentioned is the 2016 Cole paper, which went to a fair bit of effort to show that zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, in the context of sunscreens, is mostly absorbing UV. 2016 is not exactly new, but this was also common knowledge in chemistry for way, way longer. I cited a whole bunch of references in that paper that were dating back to the 90s. Another misconception is the idea that chemical sunscreens undergo a chemical reaction with UV. I explained it in this video, and this idea has led to a whole bunch of myths, like the idea that chemical sunscreens are the only ones that need reapplying. A couple of ingredients do react, but it is reversible, and most chemical and mineral sunscreens, they just have electrons that absorb UV and go to a higher energy level. Then they release that energy, mostly as heat, and come back down to the ground state.
I still think of them simply as minerals basically shield the skin like armor, whereas chemicals act as a sink and undergo a change to reduce that energy.
I usually see this myth as chemical sunscreens work like a sponge, mineral sunscreens work like a shield, so the sponge became a sink and the shield became armor. I do really like the consistent theming, but that is not correct. They both just have electrons and orbitals. And I know all of this just seems like a technicality, but this myth has led to a whole bunch of other myths that will make a difference when you're picking a sunscreen. I made this myth spawning diagram a while back, and that is pretty much the main point of the paper we wrote. This myth is making dermatologists give recommendations that might not actually give you the best option.
What you're looking for is broad spectrum coverage, which almost all mineral-based sunscreens provide.
This is one example. Almost all chemical sunscreens are also broad spectrum these days, so it is just really not a point of difference. All you're looking for is the words broad spectrum. Okay, so the other big option they give in the second episode is a supplement, and I've changed into a red flannel because here is where it starts to get extra not good. The dermatologist says the brand he takes at about 64 minutes.
Now, topical sunscreens are not the only form. By and large, there are many other forms, both physical blockers and certain things in the supplement world that can protect your skin. For example, I myself take a product called sun powder that provides an internal sun shield and allows me to be in the sun longer without the need to reapply, or if I can't reapply.
Then at about 67 minutes.
There are oral supplements that can also protect your skin from burning and reduce your skin cancer risk.
Then 74 minutes.
Don't let your skin turn red. Take some form of barrier protection, whether it's a sunscreen, a supplement like polypodium, something that protects your skin from the inside out.
Then they talk about FDA studies, 2 benzene rings, phenolic, safety. Then they go into polypodium.
Chemical-based sunscreens, probably best avoided. And then you mentioned polypodium. So this is a pill. It's a supplement, basically, that one can take. I only call it a supplement because it's not a prescription drug, correct?
Yeah.
That protects your skin from UV damage from the inside.
Yeah. So exactly right.
At 82 minutes, we get another name drop.
I personally use a form called sun powder that also has nicotinamide in it, and we can talk about nicotinamide later.
More polypodium, and then finally at almost 85 minutes, this is 20 minutes after the first name drop, we get a disclosure.
Interesting, and you mentioned sun powder as a potential, that's a brand name?
So yes, sun powder is a brand. It's a product that I helped formulate with one of my colleagues over at Harvard, who's a laser and aesthetic dermatologist, Harvard trained. And this is something that we came up with when I was up at Stanford. And it's a supplement dedicated to skin health, and it does 2 things. I take it daily myself as a single scoop.
Then they go back into mineral sunscreens. Why take the risk with chemical sunscreens? Who knows where it's collecting? This is the only relationship with sun powder that's been disclosed, except I'm actually pretty sure it's not a proper disclosure. Helped formulate is pretty vague. Most people who help formulate a product don't get paid per sale of the product, and they certainly don't own the brand. Well, I'm guessing he owns the brand. This isn't actually disclosed anywhere that I could find, but it says it's made by him on their website. He pops up on their little autoplay thing. His face is all over their Instagram, and he is linked as the agent and corporate officer on one of their documents. Disclosure is meant to be about transparency. The whole point is that we can understand the potential conflict of interest. This is not exactly clear. Now, conflict of interest aside, let's break down the claims that are being made for the different sun powder ingredients. For sun protection, there are two main ingredients, and the first one is polypodium.
A lot of studies were done on this fern in the last 5-10 years that showed it increases your skin's minimal erythema dose, the amount of redness your skin gets from UV exposure. If you're somebody who's active, like you're in the water or you're exercising or you're playing a sport and you can't reapply, I love polypodium for that added benefit. You can either take it daily as a method of preventing premature photoaging and pigmentary change, or you can take it as needed an hour before you get sun to shield you from the sun.
Yes, there have been studies on a specific standardized polypodium extract. It's called Helicare Fern Block, and it did have some sun protection benefits. But the problem is, his supplement doesn't actually have fern block. It's not even similar to fern block. It is polypodium, but you can have extracts from different parts of plants. Fern block, which is the one that they used in all of the studies that they cite for the episodes, but also on the sun powder website, that is extracted from the polypodium leaves. Sun powder contains a stem and root extract. It's like carrots. If you have carrot leaves versus carrot roots, they have very different chemicals inside them. That's why they are different colors and they don't taste the same. This is a massive problem because the active ingredients in polypodium that are responsible for sun protection, they are thought to be antioxidants. They are actually also phenolic with benzene rings. Leaves almost always have more antioxidants because they are in the sun. They have these antioxidants to protect them. Roots are not really having the same sort of exposure. They also have different antioxidants. So this is a massive stretch to talk about all of these studies on a leaf extract when what you have in your product is a stem and root extract. But they kind of had to because there aren't any good studies on stem and root except for one, which shows that root extracts aren't actually as good as leaf extracts. This study is actually summarized in one of their citations, so they should be aware of this if they read their own citations.
What are the dosages of polypodium that are useful, and are there any side effects?
Yeah, great question. So there's been a wide variety of doses investigated, anywhere from 50, 100, 240, 480. Generally,
You said 1,500 to...
50 milligrams,
50
100 milligrams,
Okay.
240, 480. Somewhere in the between 50 and 480 milligrams is what's commonly used.
This bit is also a bit strange. With plant extracts, there is a ton of variation in composition, so all of these numbers they're throwing out are meaningless. It's like different orange juices. They can be different colors, they taste different because they are going to have different levels of chemicals in them. What's in them depends on where the oranges are grown, when they're harvested. You can't just take 80 milligrams of a different polypodium extract and expect the same effects as 80 milligrams of fern block. You can compare fern block and fern block because that one is standardized. In other words, they make sure that it's consistent. They actually grow the fern and process it under controlled conditions. But if you have different leaf extracts, you can't compare them, so root and stem is even further. I'm not really sure what's going on with sun powder. The certificate of analysis actually says 50 milligrams, but their labels say 240. But either way, you can't compare what's in their sun powder with what's in studies. It's like comparing apples and oranges, or orange leaves and orange roots. Safety is also a potential issue. I know we all kind of think of natural supplements as safe, but a lot of the time they actually aren't. Turmeric and green tea supplements have been linked to liver damage, for example. And there were also some studies where antioxidant supplements actually cause cancer to grow faster. And that's before we get into things like contamination. It's just so much safer to get your antioxidants in a more balanced form like food. There is some safety data for fern block, and there is a paper linked in the show notes of the second episode, but there is just so much less than for an approved sunscreen ingredient. And again, that for FernBlock is not going to tell you about a different extract from a different part of the plant. And I mean, we were just talking about all the risks of tiny amounts of really well-studied sunscreens absorbing into blood, and they were worrying about this, but this alternative is eating not very well-studied things and actually hoping that enough gets into your blood that it'll end up getting to your skin and protecting it effectively. If we take the whole natural idea out of the equation, that bias that we all have, it's just really hard to see this objectively as a safer alternative.
Melasma is something that is very sensitive to both UV and visible light. Chemical sunscreens don't do a good job blocking visible light. Polypodium's been shown to help block the effects of visible light as well, which makes melasma worse. Sun protection is the first line, like diligent sun protection. But we found that supplementing with polypodium enhances this and makes patients' treatments more effective.
I have to give him credit for saying that polypodium isn't as good as sunscreen here, but again, all of the published studies on this use FernBlock, which is that specific standardized leaf extract. Almost all of the clinical studies on polypodium are funded or conducted by Heliocare, so you do need to take them with a grain of salt. But citing them for an extract from a different part of the plant is just so much worse. He also says this about sunscreens.
Higher the zinc concentration, the better it protects against UV and visible light. The chalkier it may go on.
This isn't true. Mineral sunscreens do not do a good job of blocking visible light unless they're tinted. And this is exactly the same for chemical sunscreens. It's actually the tint that is blocking the visible light. Even if your layer of sunscreen looks really white, there is still heaps of visible light going through. This is a really common misconception, and I think the reason he thinks this is because of that armor/shield myth. The other main sun protecting ingredient in sun powder is nicotinamide. That is the supplement name for niacinamide, which you might know from your skincare products. It is a form of vitamin B3.
It helps reduce your skin cancer risk, your non-melanoma skin cancer risk by up to 30%. And the data was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in a phase 3 randomized trial for one of the ingredients.
He's talking about this study. This is the main one on niacinamide and skin cancer. This line of research was led by Professor Diona Damian at my old uni, Sydney Uni. The problem is that up to 30% reduction is only for people at high risk of skin cancer, not everyone. That trial was done on people who had had at least 2 histologically confirmed non-melanoma skin cancers in the previous 5 years. The other studies are also on high-risk people, like transplant patients who are taking immunosuppressants. Those make you more prone to skin cancer because your immune system isn't fighting them. Also, 30% was the highest result, and that was only for one type of skin cancer. Every other number is lower. Most articles will cite the average reduction, which was 23%. So this finding is extremely limited. It wouldn't be anywhere near 30% for people who aren't actually high risk. So this is from the lead researcher. Professor Damian emphasized that using nicotinamide to prevent skin cancer is a high-dose treatment rather than a supplement. This treatment is only for people with a defined medical condition, multiple skin cancers. It's not suitable for the general population, as we do not have any evidence that it would be beneficial in a lower risk setting. This hasn't changed. It might have actually gotten less promising. She co-authored this article from September 2024, and again, it really emphasizes that it's only for high-risk skin cancer patients. It also highlights that there's been 2 new studies that may foster additional discussions regarding the efficacy and safety profile of nicotinamide. If there isn't a clear benefit, it could tip the equation. Their conclusion is that it might not even be suitable for everyone at high risk of skin cancer. I pointed this out on a post that Charlotte Parler did on sun powder, and the other brand owner, dermatologist, maybe guy, posted this. For those suffering from skin cancer, any bit of evidence-based hope for risk reduction is so important for them. But it isn't really evidence-based, and I don't know, to me, offering any bit of hope to people suffering from cancer to sell your product is pretty predatory marketing. Charlotte points out something that I also found really concerning. Sun powder is sometimes presented as a full replacement for sunscreen. This isn't really consistent in the episode or in any of their other marketing. Sometimes they do actually say it doesn't replace sunscreen, which is the responsible thing to do. Even with their dozens of studies, FernBlock will say that, but this isn't a consistent message. They do talk a bit about their own testing.
It took us several years of formulation and testing, including MED testing, which is minimal erythema dose testing, to come up with. It's easy over the counter, and it's one of many supplements that contain polypodium. I just like it because it's a single scoop, and I mix it into my morning drink, and I'm done.
Terrific.
MED testing is essentially the same sort of testing as for sunscreen. They look at how much UV your skin can handle before it turns red. Then they see how much it can take once you've got sunscreen or the supplement. I think he referred to this testing in this comment to try to prove that he understood sunscreen safety and toxicology, which is a completely different thing. But anyway, this sort of testing is not the same for sunscreens versus supplements. Sunscreen works before the UV hits your skin, so how quickly your skin gets red actually directly tells you how much UV the sunscreen is blocking. But for a supplement, all of the UV is getting into your skin before it starts interacting with whatever's in the supplement. So it's really just showing that it's undoing one effect of the UV. It is probably undoing a few more, but there is UV still getting in and causing other types of damage. It's like deodorant versus showering. Once you start using deodorant, how much you smell is not going to be directly measuring how clean you are. So this is why it is such a big problem when sun powder is shown as an alternative.
Don't let your skin turn red. Take some form of barrier protection, whether it's a sunscreen, a supplement like polypodium, something that protects your skin from the inside out. I take that one to prevent, sun-related changes, but also help reduce my risk of burning. Often when I personally find the need for sunscreen, it's when I can't apply. Always at the water, I'm swimming, my son, he's 7, he races on a swim team. I cannot get this kid to reapply sunscreen. So this is a supplement that I give him.
Look, I live in a very sunny, very watery country. I can assure you, you can absolutely reapply sunscreen while swimming. Maybe your kid is a stubborn little shit, but you are an adult. I'm not sure how you're in all these situations where you just can't reapply, or you could at least wear a rash shirt. Their website also really leans into this whole you don't need to reapply selling point. Here are some of the social media screenshots that they actually chose to feature. Most sunscreens do more harm than good. No need for excessive sunscreen use anymore. Like sunscreen, but in a drink form. This is the first supplement to give you long-lasting sun protection without having the stress about reapplication. Well, big asterisk there. I'll be skiing all day, so I'm drinking my SPF for optimal sun protection. Total sun protection for your skin. These are not automatic. These are testimonials that they personally chose to feature on that website. They manually picked these out. They have some dermatologists giving testimonials too, just for extra authority bias, that white coat bias, that sort of tendency we have to trust people who look like experts. They have this guy who also said that succinic acid is a proven acne treatment. We have all-in-one skin protection from the sun, standalone or supplemental product. I don't understand how this is actually legal. Is it actually legal? You wacky Americans. Now, onto sun exposure. A lot of people ask me if this part was dangerous messaging.
The vast majority of dermatologists out there and skincare experts really understand that sun exposure can accelerate aging of the skin, but most will also tell you that some sun exposure is good for you, not just for skin health, but for overall brain and body health.
This might surprise some of you, but I actually agree with the overall gist of the message here. There is a lot of any sun exposure is bad messaging coming from the US, and that is mostly what you see online, but that isn't actually the scientific or the public health consensus. The official Australian public health advice has been recommending some sun exposure since maybe the mid-2000s, even though we are the skin cancer capital of the world, because there is evidence that sun exposure has benefits. Vitamin D has been the main focus because it is really direct. We produce vitamin D in our skin, and UV is actually needed to come in and break a chemical bond in that process. But it looks like vitamin D might not actually be the main reason for health benefits. It could just be correlation. So if you have more vitamin D, then you're more likely to have had enough sun to give you those other health benefits. Vitamin D supplements don't seem to work as well as sun. There's been some research on some other possible benefits like sunlight coming in and producing nitric oxide. So to balance the risks and the benefits of sun exposure, Australia came up with a guideline and it's based on UV index. This is a way of measuring how much harmful UV there is. For everyday activities, if the UV index is 3 or over, then you should use sun protection, which is the full suite of sun protection, not just sunscreen. But if it's 2 or below, then you don't need it. And this is just on a day-to-day basis for avoiding skin cancer. It's like if you're going to the office and back, you're not outside for more than about an hour. This UV Index 2/3 guideline is kind of everywhere now. The World Health Organization uses it. It's on the US EPA website. It is on this fridge magnet that I got at a sun protection conference. It's on weather apps, but I rarely hear it from US people, and this might be because in the US, the perceived experts who are talking about sun protection, they are mostly dermatologists, and sun is mostly bad for skin. But in Australia, the guidelines were an interdisciplinary collaboration. There were dermatologists involved, as well as epidemiologists, bone and metabolic health experts, cancer and MS experts, and general practitioners, so it's a lot more about overall health. I actually did a video on this in 2017, and I need to do a new one because the Australian guidelines have actually been updated and they now take skin tone into account. But this advice, use sun protection when the UV index is 3 or over, that still generally works for most people who have lighter skin. I really like this approach. It is really sensible. UV index is the best way to gauge how safe it is. Again, with things like shade and temperature, those are really misleading for UV, so having an actual number in the weather report is really awesome. But you need to know what the number means and what to do when it is a certain number. So it's just such a missed opportunity to me that Huberman mentions UV index, but he never actually says a number like 2 or 3.
When the sun is low in the sky, low solar angle sunlight, the UV index tends to be very low. That's generally a safe time to get sun exposure. It's that midday sun. The sun is overhead and at its greatest intensity, and where the UV index can be very high. It's very easy to look up the UV index, and when the UV index is very high, right? I was down in Australia earlier this year, and the UV index down there is so high. You should not rely on just that subjective feel. You should look up the UV index, and we'll provide a few links of good UV index sites that you can look up the UV index and where you might want to be extra cautious about providing a physical barrier or a chemical barrier to protect your skin.
The whole time, I am just waiting for him to say an actual number. I'm guessing he probably doesn't know the actual guideline because he keeps saying very high, but I mean, the scale goes up to over 11. 2 is really not that high. It is officially, you have to wear sun protection when it's just moderate or over. Very high is 8 to 10, which is much higher than 2. Stanford, which is where he is, that has an average UV index of over 2 for 11 months of the year. And I don't think people are expecting winter UV to be very high. This guideline is actually in the paper that he cited for the first episode, so maybe he just didn't have time to read it properly. I think overall he does give a decent balance of warning about the risks and also mentioning the benefits, but without a number like UV index 3, it's just really not that actionable. Again, I am speculating that it's because his main source is that dermatologist and he also doesn't seem to know the number.
How much sun exposure to the skin is good for us? Is it 0? Is it 5 minutes? Does it depend?
The dermatologist gives a very vague response. He mentions skin tone, he mentions mood, which is good, but then he also talks about a whole bunch of stuff that just isn't relevant.
I lived on the East Coast in places that had lower days of sun, and I had seasonal affective disorder. It bothered me. My mood was lower. I felt not as healthy. You know, I'd come home, my family would say, "Hey, you look sick." And I wasn't sick. I hadn't had any sun. I was lighter than I was. And my family interpreted that as not being healthy.
Seasonal affective disorder is mostly about visible light, not UV, and you need exposure through your eyes, not through your skin. Light therapy boxes for SAD do not use UV. Tanning, yes, a lot of people do think a tan looks healthier, and people telling you that you look sick is probably pretty annoying, but that doesn't have that much to do with actual health, and Australians know this really well.
There's nothing healthy about a tan.
Absolute classic. Fake tan will do the same thing, and just adjusting your beauty standards, tell your family to stop being rude. He does mention UV index once.
I mean, midday sun has a higher UV index, so you're more likely to burn and have a problem with prolonged exposure.
And that's true, but then his actual advice?
The other important thing about being out in the sun is finding out your own tolerance. There isn't a finite amount of time because that time is dictated by your skin's ability to tolerate the UV. Absolutely, I think you should be out in the sun. I don't think you should burn, and I don't think you should be out long enough where your skin starts to turn red. Obviously, too much sun exposure, like anything, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. But I really do think that being out in the sun for the amount that your skin can tolerate is a good thing.
There is literally a number in the weather report that was invented to help you work out how much your skin can tolerate. And I'm not saying that you can't disagree with this guideline. If you have evidence, if you've calculated how many joules of erythemally weighted UV you think would be more appropriate, then yes, by all means, present your case. But it really just sounds like he doesn't know that this is even a thing. Some other things about vitamin D aren't accurate, and they are again explained in that paper that were linked in the show notes.
Even if you wear sunscreen or a physical barrier when you get outside into the sun, it can still have a positive effect on your vitamin D levels. Of course, it makes sense. Sunlight is full spectrum light. It's not just UV and short wavelength light. Longer wavelengths can also impart a positive influence on the vitamin D pathway. So if you're concerned about wearing sunscreen because you're worried that it's going to impair your vitamin D synthesis or metabolism in any way, probably no reason to be concerned.
Yes, people who use sunscreen still seem to make enough vitamin D, but it isn't because the other wavelengths help. The wavelengths for vitamin D are actually the same ones that are strongly linked to sunburn and skin cancer. Here's what it looks like. This is from that paper. The vitamin D hump is almost entirely within the red line, and most experts think that it should actually be shifted a bit to the left, so even more inside that red line. This is the whole reason why Australian experts were agonizing so much over this guideline. The same wavelengths both will protect and attack. The paper also explains why people probably still get enough vitamin D. It's suboptimal sunscreen application. No one applies sunscreen perfectly, everyone skips at least little spots, and it rubs off. I'll go into all of the numbers and calculations behind the guidelines in a future video, but the short version, the dose or level of exposure to UV is really important, and it varies a lot. If I had to generalize, I would say that most people need a lot less sun than they think in summer, and then a lot more in the middle of winter. The best recommendation is just this: UV index 3 or over, then use sun protection when you go outside. You'll end up getting enough sun anyway. If it's 2 or below, then you don't need sun protection unless you are in the sun for longer than an hour, and you might actually want to go outside and purposely get sun if the index is 2 or below in the middle of the day. If you have dark skin and you rarely burn, you probably only need protection if you're in the sun for more than a few hours. And not getting enough sun is probably going to be more of a concern. Keep in mind this is just for overall health. If you care about wrinkles or pigment, then you probably want to at least protect your face from the sun most of the time, maybe sacrifice a leg. On to the other skincare advice. Let's start with the weirdest bit, moisturizers.
What are some of the parameters for selecting a moisturizer?
Simple things you want to look for. Is it non-comedogenic? That's a word you want to look for any moisturizer that's been tested not to clog your pores. That's a basic thing to look for where you won't cause another problem in trying to fix one problem.
If you just know dermatologists from social media, you might think that all they do is look at skincare products, but standard dermatology syllabuses don't really cover that much skincare outside of medical treatments. If you look in the big dermatology textbooks, the skincare information in there is just really thin and basic. There isn't much past what you might see on Reddit. There's nothing on most of the skincare topics that I've talked about on this channel. I know quite a few dermatologists now, and a lot of them told me that they actually found me because patients were asking them questions that they couldn't answer. One dermatologist told me that in her training, she actually learned more about snakebite than skincare, and she wasn't Australian, she is from the US. A few programs go more into skincare, and some derms go and learn it themselves. They have a background in skin, so they can understand it at a deeper level. But it isn't standard dermatology, so a lot of derms will get things wrong. These things are actually wrong in the dermatology textbooks and papers. It doesn't usually matter that much because practicing dermatologists have other priorities, but it does matter when dermatologists maybe talk to journalists or go on social media or talk on podcasts, because people do take dermatologists more seriously. They are perceived to be these skincare experts. If you've seen my Instagram or my debunking videos, you'll know that a lot of BS goes viral because a dermatologist said it. With non-comedogenic, these moisturizers might still clog your pores because it's not a regulated term. More responsible companies will test the finished product on acne-prone people, and then they'll put the label non-comedogenic, but it is still really individual. So for example, the composition of your sebum can be different and that combines with the product, and then finally that mixture might be the thing causing clogged pores. But that is the best case scenario. Most of the time, non-comedogenic just means that a product doesn't have ingredients that have high comedogenicity ratings. This is a list that you can find. It was put together using unrealistic studies. For example, they rub the pure ingredient on rabbit ears. I have a video on that. The ingredient isn't going to behave the same when it's mixed with lots of other ingredients in a moisturizer and then mixing with the stuff on your skin.
Generally speaking, there are 3 flavors of moisturizers. There's ointments, there's creams, and there's lotions. Ointments are greasy. They're like petrolatum jelly or Vaseline based. Those are the best for moisturizing your skin, but they're greasy. Then there's creams, which are water emulsions with oil suspended in it. And then there's lotions, which are generally powders that are resuspended with water.
Moisturizing lotions are not powders resuspended with water. I guess that is the most glaring problem here. If you've tried maybe 2 creams and 2 lotions in your entire life, you'll know that they largely feel the same. They will sink into your skin, they make it smoother and softer, less tight and flaky, maybe even a little bit oily. And that is because both creams and lotions are usually oil in water emulsions, which he does describe correctly. They are droplets of oil suspended in water. The main difference is how thick in texture they are, but there isn't like a clear line. The name that they get is mostly just marketing. There are so-called creams that are runnier than some so-called lotions. The only rule that anyone seems to follow is that if it is thick enough to come in a jar, then they're not going to call it a lotion. Powders suspended in water? I was really confused about why he thought these were lotions until I went off and looked up some dermatology textbooks. For some really bizarre reason, a bunch of the really popular ones have decided that the only type of lotion there is calamine and drying lotions, which are products that look a bit like this. They have a powder in water, I guess. But these sorts of products are definitely not moisturizers. I mean, they are kind of the opposite. They even have the word drying in the name. The powders will soak up oil.
Is it in a pump bottle or is it in a jar? Jars tend to be more occlusive. They tend to provide more moisturization, but they can lead to problems like acne and breakouts, whereas things in a pump bottle, because they're powders in suspension and they have to put alcohol in the product to allow it to come out of the pump mechanism, they tend to be lighter and not provide as much moisturization.
Yeah, no. I've seen a few dermatologists say this now, the idea that thicker means more oil, more moisturizing, more occlusive, and again, I think it is because it is in dermatology textbooks, but it's not correct. How thick a cream or lotion is mostly comes from emulsifiers. If you have more waxy emulsifiers, these are ingredients that come as solids, you end up with a thicker product. But emulsifiers don't really change how moisturizing the product is, so this is just not correlated. By default, most products are thin. You actually need to add things to get a thicker texture. You don't need to thin something down to get it to work in a pump. And you don't need to thin it down with alcohol. Water is already super runny. I just grabbed the first 4 products I had that were pumps. There's no alcohol in any of these. I would say that at least 80% of the pump products on the market do not have alcohol, and if they do have alcohol, it isn't just to thin it for the pump. Now, there is a grain of truth here. Thicker products tend to be more moisturizing, but that's just because people expect them to be more moisturizing, so formulators will add more thickeners if you're making a product for dry skin. But that doesn't let you compare between different brands, for example. There are tons of runny lotions out there that are actually more moisturizing than thicker creams. So instead of thinking about ointments /creams /lotions and then jars versus pumps, it is just way more useful to think about 3 categories of moisturizing ingredients. Occlusives seal in water, emollients replace oils in your skin, and humectants hold on to water. This table is from my ebook, The Lab Muffin Guide to Basic Skincare. If you have oily skin, then you want lots of humectants, maybe use occlusives at night. Dry skin, you're going to want everything. Then you also want to look at what skin type the product is designed for. That will be on the front. And then, if you can, also look up some reviews or try a sample. Depending on your preference and your climate, you might prefer a thicker or a thinner texture.
When I think about something in a jar, Aquaphor or something, which is pretty thick.
Greasy
thick stuff, not okay for somebody with acne.
Yeah, exactly. The greasier, the more occlusion it provides, but in doing so, it clogs everything.
Greasier doesn't always mean more occlusive or better at sealing in moisture. Aquaphor is mostly petroleum jelly, and that is the most occlusive ingredient, but that is a massive exception here. If you have a pure plant oil, that's not going to be as occlusive as mineral oil or dimethicone, even though it is going to feel thicker and greasier. Plant oils have unsaturated fatty acids. That means they have bulkier molecular structures. They're not going to tessellate as well, and they're not going to form as good of a barrier. There are lots of runny lotions out there that have petrolatum and mineral oil. They're going to be much more moisturizing and occlusive than a thick body butter that is mostly made of plant oils. Also, thicker things like Aquaphor, that doesn't mean it's going to be more pore clogging. There is a pretty famous study that demonstrated pure petroleum jelly is non-comedogenic. And again, it depends on so many individual factors like how sticky your skin cells and skin oil are and the overall formula. There are a bunch of recommendations that he has under the umbrella of Youthful Skin. Anti-aging is one of the biggest categories in skincare. It mostly refers to reducing wrinkles. In the subheadings of episode 1, there are a whole bunch of ingredients that you might actually recognize, but guess how many of these he recommends mostly for putting onto your face? It is literally just 2. This is super weird because almost every dermatologist and scientist who knows skincare science, they're going to tell you that there is so much more evidence for things that you actually put on your skin. Your skin is at the edge of your body, so it's a lot harder to affect it with things like oral supplements. So nani the fuck is going on here? I was pretty confused until I thought about which experts he was talking to, and again, it just seems like his main source is this guy who is selling a supplement that contains 4 of these ingredients.
You got to consider the source. You have to consider the source.
Let's go through them. First off, collagen. I think he actually gives a pretty balanced view on them, but the recommendations again are just a bit whack. Collagen is a protein, which is a chain of amino acids. He mentions that a lot of people say collagen cannot possibly work because proteins are digested and then broken down. There's no reason why they would be used as building blocks specifically to rebuild collagen in your skin.
I don't believe, and there is frankly zero evidence for selective trafficking of amino acids arising from a particular organ source to that particular organ when you ingest it. It is interesting that consuming hydrolyzed collagen does seem to be able to improve collagen synthesis or the appearance of skin.
But collagen has a unique amino acid called hydroxyproline. It's not really in other proteins. So fragments with this hydroxyproline could potentially be playing a signaling role. They can be specifically detected in your body. There are a few different proposed mechanisms, but essentially, it would be acting more like a drug, a signaling molecule, rather than a nutrient or a building block. These fragments have been detected in blood after eating collagen, so they are getting absorbed. But having this sort of plausible mechanism doesn't necessarily mean that something works or that it's worth taking. It just means that we can't really dismiss it as complete BS. I talked about this in my rosemary oil for hair loss video, but basically, there are heaps of mechanisms going on inside your body and they add up to give your overall result. For example, I am really short, but that doesn't mean that I am automatically better at gymnastics and horse racing than someone who is tall. I am pretty good at gymnastics, but I have ridden a horse maybe twice and I was not good at it. There are a lot of other mechanisms at play. Mechanisms also don't tell you about how much you need to take or how big the overall effect is. He does mention there are some promising clinical trials, which is true, but the effect in them just isn't all that big, and overall, the evidence isn't that strong. Like most things in beauty, these studies are mostly funded or done in conjunction with companies who are selling collagen. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that they're bad. Some studies are done with universities and government organizations. Some of them even don't seem to have any conflicts of interest. But it does mean that if you look at the results, they are all kind of on the optimistic side. So we have a small effect, we have not very robust evidence, plus collagen supplements are generally pretty pricey. There's also the risk of contamination because supplements are not well regulated in that respect. Out of all of the skincare supplements, I think collagen has one of the strongest bodies of evidence. But supplements in general just aren't that well supported. I don't think collagen is worth it unless you are already using more evidence-based and cost-effective products and treatments, and you want to do even more.
The dermatologist that I spoke to said if one decides to go down this route of supplementing or getting collagen from food sources, you want to aim for anywhere from 15 grams to 30 grams of collagen peptides per day. That's a bit higher than what was used in a number of studies, but you'll find studies that use 30 grams.
This is similar to that polypodium issue, and honestly, I am kind of surprised that he's saying this. I haven't really listened to his podcast a lot, but I do know he recommends a lot of supplements, including natural extracts. The variation there can be really massive, so a solid number just doesn't really work unless you have a lot of extra footnotes. Now, not all collagen is the same. In supplements, we have hydrolyzed collagen or collagen peptides, which means that chain of amino acids is chopped up. And the chopped up peptides can be different sizes, and size is going to make a big difference in how much gets absorbed into your body. He talks about food and supplements together, but in food, the collagen is a lot bigger and it's harder to absorb. There is a study where they looked at hydrolyzed collagen, and that gave 3 times the level of peptides in blood compared to eating the same amount of collagen in food. Now, with the numbers, 15 to 30 grams of collagen, I think maybe he's mixed up collagen supplements for skin and collagen supplements for joints and exercise. 10 grams is the highest that I've found in skin studies. They usually use 2.5 to 5 grams. For skin supplements, that would mean you are taking 5 to 10 times more, spending 5 to 10 times more than what we actually have evidence for. If you want to try collagen, then I would recommend going with the specific type that was used in a clinical trial, for example, Verisol, and then match the actual amount. You don't want to take more than the recommended serve because there's usually other stuff in there that you probably don't want to overdose on. Interestingly, the Dermatologist supplement only has 0.1 grams of collagen per serve. So you would actually need 5 tubs a day to get 15 grams, and if you just want 2.5 grams, you need 25 doses, almost a full tub. It's super wild to me that they're making any claims about collagen benefits just with that tiny amount. They actually, in their website, call it a microdose, which I guess is a really clever way of marketing not putting enough in. Collagen is one of the most evidence support supplements, and that still isn't super evidence-based, so it kind of goes downhill from there.
That whole process can be augmented, can be improved through ingestion of 500 to 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C as well.
He mentions taking this along with collagen to help the collagen production, which kind of makes sense because you do need vitamin C for that, but the evidence does not show the same effects with oral supplements versus topical application. Topical application is when you put something directly on your skin. It's probably a difference with how that vitamin C gets distributed through the different routes. So for example, the most demonstrated benefit for vitamin C is preventing sunburn because it's an antioxidant just like foam block. Again, it doesn't replace sunscreen, it's just undoing some of that damage. Orally, there isn't really a big effect in studies, but topically there is. There are some great topical products out there. I talked about what to look for in this video. He talks about checking if you have enough copper in your diet and then maybe taking a supplement. Copper deficiency is really rare. It is really unlikely that supplementing is going to make any sort of difference for your skin. I think maybe he heard something about copper peptides being an anti-aging ingredient. This is GHKCU, which does have some evidence behind it, but again, that is for when you put it on your skin, not when you eat it. I would still put it below a whole bunch of ingredients that weren't mentioned in either episode. I will get to that, but the beneficial compound here is the peptide, not the copper. They talk more about niacinamide. This is another ingredient where almost all of the benefits are from topical application, actually getting it on your skin. There is almost no evidence for oral supplements, but that is mostly what they talk about.
I spoke to board-certified dermatologists who trained at excellent institutions. They mentioned supplementing with niacinamide. And I was told that when taken at twice per day at a dosage of 500 milligrams per dose, niacinamide supplementation can increase the production of ceramides, which relate to the lipids in skin that improve the moisture in skin. The supplementation has to be carried out for 3 to 6 months or more before that effect is noticed.
For ceramide production, there's no direct evidence for oral supplements. The closest there is that Australian nicotinamide trial. They actually measured transepidermal water loss. That is how much water is escaping through your skin barrier. After 3 to 12 months of taking 1 gram a day, which is a really high dose, there were single-digit decreases. But if you look in the literature, there are a whole bunch of studies that looked at decreases with 2 to 5% niacinamide on your skin. For example, one study used a really basic 2% niacinamide product that only had 3 ingredients. They saw over 20% decrease in transepidermal water loss. Plus, they actually measured lipid increases. 2% is really low and most formulas are way more sophisticated. Topical niacinamide is just so much more proven, so much more effective, less risky, and just more convenient. the evidence is very, very much topical over oral niacinamide.
Niacinamide supplementation appears to balance the level of oil production in the skin. It can definitely help reduce the appearance of clogged pores, and if you're concerned about pores that appear too large, niacinamide supplementation may assist with that as well.
Oil and pore reduction are again demonstrated for topical niacinamide, not for oral. There is nothing for niacinamide supplements.
There's also a number of people out there that are concerned with specific spots that they see as hyperpigmented spots. Supplementation with niacinamide can reduce the appearance of accumulation and maybe even the actual accumulation of melanin at particular spots, so-called dark pigmented spots.
Again, dozens of clinical trials on topical niacinamide for hyperpigmentation, nothing for oral supplements, not even for melasma, which is a medical condition that gets researched more. There is more evidence for oral melatonin than oral niacinamide. Topical niacinamide gets mentioned near the end, and here is the recommendation.
The dermatologists tell me that to be effective, the niacinamide needs to be present at least a 2 and as high as 10% concentration within those ointments or serums.
This is one of my gripes when it comes to a lot of dermatologists and medical doctors talking about skincare, and a lot of scientists as well, and I used to be one of them a very long time ago. They focus too much on specific percentages and matching the clinical trial. But skincare just doesn't work this way because formulation varies so much. How much of the 2 or 10% that's actually in the product getting into your skin to get to the biological targets, that depends on the delivery system, the type of product you have. He mentions niacinamide ointments a few times, and niacinamide, it's just rarely in an ointment because ointments are not an effective way to get niacinamide into your skin. I think this focus on percentage comes from doctors being used to medications because that actually works there. So you don't need brand name Nurofen. If you have generic, it's going to work the same if you have the same amount. Say you have 200 milligrams. But the only reason that actually works is because generic drugs have to demonstrate something called bioequivalence to get approved. Basically, it has to be shown to work the same biologically. The active ingredient has to be released from the formulation the same way. Bioequivalence isn't regulated for skincare, so you have to be really careful when looking at percentages. Some studies showed good effects with a really basic 2% niacinamide formula. If you have a more advanced 1% formula, that is probably going to work just as well or potentially better. Hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is one of the few ingredients where they talk about putting it on skin. It is a humectant that holds onto water really well, and I agree with this recommendation. Some types can also get into skin and work as an active ingredient. It's been kind of unfairly demonized by some people, but that is a topic for a different video. Retinoids are mentioned in both episodes, which is nice. They are vitamin A derivatives. I've done a bunch of deep dive videos on them. They are the gold standard ingredients in skincare because they do tons of stuff. They increase collagen, they clear pores, they even out pigment, they can even treat skin cancers. Basically, anyone with any sort of skin concern can probably benefit from retinoids. But again, the recommendations here are a bit weird.
This is why, and please pay careful attention to this is why women who are pregnant or breastfeeding should avoid taking these products because it can seriously disrupt the development of the fetus. Okay, and keep in mind that many times people don't realize they're pregnant for some period of time. So this is of paramount concern.
It is really not that much of a concern. Oral retinoids like isotretinoin, Accutane, those are taken as tablets. Those can be proper concerns. They have caused birth defects even though they were pregnancy warnings all over the boxes. But topical retinoids, the ones that you put on skin, and especially the ones that aren't prescription drugs, they are really not that much of a concern. They mostly stay in your skin, and the amount that gets to your blood and can potentially reach a fetus is just really low. Vitamin A in food is going to be more of a risk. But medical doctors are really cautious because of what happened with those oral retinoids. So I think it is reasonable to avoid them if you're pregnant and you are worried. It's just simply not worth the stress. But I think a lot of the warnings are just over the top and counterproductive. I often get pregnant people in my inbox freaking out because they used a sunscreen with retinol palmitate once. The most sensible official guidelines I've seen are from MotherSafe in New South Wales, which is where I am. They say that cosmetic retinoids are fine.
These different compounds can also increase sensitivity to light, make you more prone to sunburn, to some of the other effects of light on skin, even from screens or from artificial lights.
This is also not true. The retinoids used for anti-aging do not make your skin more sensitive to sunlight, and definitely not to screens or artificial lights. Even oral isotretinoin doesn't do this. There is one oral retinoid which is usually used for psoriasis called etretinate. That one will do that, but tretinoin, adapalene, retinol, and so on do not. A lot of them can break down in sunlight though, so you want to use them at night, but it's not a problem for your skin. If anything, it means they don't work as well on your skin and you might not get the retinoid-associated irritation.
I recommend every single person to be on a prescription strength retinoid, which is different than over-the-counter retinol. The most common are things like tretinoin, adapalene, or tazarotene.
As a medicinal chemist trained in cosmetic formulation, it is kind of annoying always seeing people, usually people who are trying to sell a product line, misuse the term over-the-counter. Over-the-counter is a category of drug, and they are the ones that you can get without a prescription. They have been through a drug approval process, so they are more proven in terms of safety and efficacy, and producing them is a lot more regulated. So adapalene or Differin is most commonly an over-the-counter drug. You don't need a prescription. If you go to the US, it is sitting on the shelf at Ulta. Sunscreen is another example of an over-the-counter drug. Retinol is a cosmetic. It is not over-the-counter.
Because the medication was so effective, the cosmeceutical beauty world said, oh, okay, this is awesome. We need to figure out a way to get this on the shelf, but not be a prescription. Out came retinols with an OL, which is the inactive version of retinoic acid, which is retinoids. Retinol needs to be converted in a two-step process to become active retinoic acid. Otherwise, it's a completely inactive prodrug, which is sold over the counter at concentrations that are not biologically active.
This is another big terminology thing that really annoys me because it has led to so many misunderstandings. The term retinoid means any active ingredient that ends up acting at the retinol receptors. So it is anything in this big category of vitamin A related compounds. Retinol, which is in cosmetics, is a retinoid. A lot of dermatologists use the term retinoid to mean just drug retinoids, mostly because they think that there is this big divide where drug retinoids will act directly at receptors, but cosmetic retinoids like retinol, they think that they're weaker or inactive because they are prodrugs, which means they need to be converted in the skin before they turn into the active form and can act. But this is just not true at all. Tazarotene is a prescription retinoid that is a prodrug. It starts off inactive, but it ends up being one of the more effective retinoids. The order of events is also wrong here. Retinol was actually studied before tretinoin. It worked really well, and that is actually why the scientists kept looking at retinoids.
Many studies have shown that almost all retinols over the counter are basically unstabilized by 1 year. The prescription is easy to get, and it's the only version that's truly effective.
This is kind of true. The main issue with retinol is stability, and that is why the scientists switched to studying tretinoin. They didn't know how to stabilize retinol back then. There are a lot of unstable products out there, but these days, there are a lot of drugstore products that are stabilized really well, they work well, and you should be able to use them up within a year. They're developed by the same companies that develop tretinoin formulas. There are also lots of studies showing that they work. There are also lots of stabilized retinol products, and there's research on some retinol ester formulas. It's just really naive to say cosmetic retinoids don't work or that they're all inactive. I covered this in a video before. Now, the weirdest thing to me about these retinoid recommendations is that in the first episode, Huberman only really talks about prescription retinoids and retinol esters. These are like two complete opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of evidence. There are just so many options in the middle. Again, I was really confused until I thought about who he actually talked to for this episode.
The dermatologists and the cosmetic surgeons that work on faces that I spoke to. I told you I consulted with a fairly large and diversified group of folks in preparation for this episode.
Obviously, dermatologists are mostly going to be recommending prescription retinoids, but there's also this bit.
Now, I talked to a cosmetic surgeon expert in face specifically, who also specializes in these sorts of treatments for skin. And they've started using and are frankly quite confident in the use of retinoid esters that can be applied to the surface of the skin. I do provide a link to at least one source of those that uses the retinoid ester.
This is the product he linked. It is $550 US. This is the most expensive retinoid product I've ever seen. It contains gram-active retinoid, which is actually in a lot of much cheaper products, it is in an ordinary product. I'm guessing that the cosmetic surgeon is the Dr. Diamond who sells this. There is a selfie of them together on their Instagram. Huberman says there is no business relationship, which I can believe, but it's just really disappointing that he doesn't seem to be doing much research outside of what the people selling the products are telling him. I think retinol esters can be a good option if your skin is really sensitive to retinoids or when you have irritated skin, but there are just so many options in between. You can get adapalene over the counter, there's tons of retinol and retinol products, plus there are retinol esters that have much more research. Some of the best retinol products come from drugstore brands. They have the market power to invest in proper scientific research, and they can still sell affordable products. There are so many peer-reviewed studies from them in the scientific literature. I mean, it looks like there are other selling points to this $550 product. I'm not saying it might not be worth it for some people, but in terms of retinoid recommendations for a very large audience, a lot of whom might not have tried any retinoids before, again, it is just such a missed opportunity. A lot of people are not going to get told the products that probably are the best option for them. I'm going to talk about two more things he recommends really quickly. Firstly, light treatments. I think there is enough evidence to say that they do something, but which products and if they make other things worse, so things like infrared can darken pigment, I think it mostly comes down to whether you are consistent with using these and how much money you're willing to spend. I will do a proper video on them soon. Peptides. This section is kind of weird because he only really talks about BCP-157. This is used by gym people, I guess, for more performance enhancement purposes, and these companies have started marketing them for skin. He does say that the evidence is just mechanistic. It could increase vascularization, that could help his crow's feet. But there's no clinical studies, it might actually not get through skin, and he does ask people to leave their anecdotes in the comments. I guess I just find it kind of weird that there are peptides in skincare that have more evidence than BCP-157. I'm guessing he's talking about it because his audience have asked about it, but if you want vascularization, retinoids do that as well, and they also do a ton of other stuff, and there is all of this evidence on them. You don't need to buy a dodgy product from a dodgy guy in some back alley. My top recommendations, like I mentioned before, there are a bunch of ingredients that he just didn't recommend here. We can think of this sort of like a hierarchy, so if you don't care about how your skin looks, just your skin health, then you're looking at things at the base of this hierarchy. You want sunscreen, cleanser, and moisturizer. I have a lot more details about how to pick these in my guide to basic skincare, things like what ingredients to look for. Then on top of that, we have things that will improve your skin, things like getting youthful skin. Now, I like to discuss evidence in detail, and I am working on an advanced skincare guide. But I did have to summarize my top picks for wrinkles in my book, The Science of Beauty. At the base of this, the stuff with the most evidence are retinoids. We're talking things like drug retinoids, tretinoin, tazarotene. I have a video about those. Also cosmetic ones like retinol and retinol, which I have a video on coming soon. We also have exfoliants here, and I find it kind of weird that these weren't covered because there is quite a lot of evidence on these for getting rid of the top layers of your skin, getting more skin turnover so that your younger cells are coming up near the top. There's also things like peels which have these in a stronger concentration. These are ingredients like glycolic acid, lactic acid, salicylic acid, also polyhydroxy acids. I talk about these in my free exfoliation guide. We also have antioxidants, and these will soak up free radicals, which is what the antioxidant part is about. But a lot of these also have other benefits as well. So the one that has the most evidence is vitamin C, and that can work better in conjunction with other antioxidants like vitamin E, ferulic acid, glutathione. We also have things like niacinamide and peptides, so these are also quite evidence-backed as well. On top of this, we also have to mention pigmentation because wrinkles is sort of like how skin that is whiter tends to age, but if your skin is melanocompetent, it's good at putting out pigment, then most of the time your skin is more protected from wrinkles and fine lines, but your skin tends to go uneven in color as you age. So there's a lot of ingredients that work quite well for it, including the ones that work well for wrinkles. There's a lot of overlap, but there's also other ingredients like hydroquinone, and I have a video all about hyperpigmentation. There are other ingredients I like, but I feel like these ones will already get you off to a really good start. On top of that, we have things like clinical treatments, lasers, Botox, and fillers. Those can also really help in different ways. There's also, I guess, more lifestyle factors, things like not sleeping on your side, not sleeping on your front is really helpful for sleep wrinkles. So sleep wrinkles is from when your face, the weight of your head, is squishing down your skin and you end up bending a wrinkle into it. So sleeping on your back can be really helpful for that. But on the flip side, if that is affecting your quality of sleep, maybe you might want to rethink that, because quality of sleep can also help with anti-aging. Now, in the rest of the video, they cover a lot on skin conditions, things like psoriasis and rosacea. I'm not going to touch these because these are more dermatological. Maybe a dermatologist can talk about it, but I am going to talk about their acne recommendations because I do have acne-prone skin. I am pretty familiar with the standard science-based advice about it. So one really weird thing to me is that they mention things that are quite far down the list of evidence-based treatments, things like niacinamide supplements, phototherapy, not over-cleansing. They also mention a whole bunch of lifestyle changes.
What can be done to directly address acne? Well, there are a number of different prescription treatments that your dermatologist can suggest, but one thing that all the dermatologists agree upon is, first of all, getting adequate sleep, reducing stress, taking care of your gut microbiome, the nutrition recommendations that we've been talking about up until now.
But they don't mention a lot of the low-cost, low-risk, non-prescription treatments that have stronger evidence. These are the ones that medical dermatologists who specialize in acne always recommend trying first, even before you go and see them. Acne is a really common medical condition, so there are a lot of evidence-based guidelines and systematic reviews on which things have the most evidence, and there is a lot of very clear consensus about what is near the top. Now, I don't know if the reason this has been skipped is because Dr. Soleymani, he specializes in surgery and skin cancer, not medical treatment of acne. Or it might be the paper that they cite.
There are things that we can do for acne. I'll provide a link to one of the major sources I used for researching this episode, a systematic review and network meta-analysis of topical, pharmacological, oral pharmacological, physical, and combined treatments for acne vulgaris.
This paper recommends light treatments for acne, but the abstract is a lot more optimistic than the actual paper. The actual paper says several times that the evidence is limited and uncertain. It is a really controversial recommendation. The British Association of Dermatologists and the American Academy of Dermatology both do not recommend it over some more tested treatments. So some of these non-prescription things that I was really expecting to hear, because they have been the standard first-line recommendations in pretty much every clinical guideline for acne for years: adapalene, benzoyl peroxide, salicylic acid, azelaic acid. If you want to know more about acne, I would highly recommend checking out Dr. John Barbieri's channel. It is criminally underrated. He is one of the top acne dermatologists, not just online, but actually within dermatology. He does a lot of acne research, and he is the co-chair of the AAD's Acne Guideline Work Group. These guidelines are much less controversial, and it comes with a 700-page document that explains all of their evidence evaluations.
A few of the derms told me sometimes just a few adjustments to their diet, the exclusion of certain things, mainly highly processed foods, maybe reducing dairy and increasing the amount of things that reduce inflammation, so more fruits and vegetables and meat, fish, eggs from healthy sources, and seeing dramatic improvements in acne. So that's always reassuring to hear. Doesn't always require prescription medication.
In both episodes, there's a lot of stuff about the mechanism of how foods could lead to inflammation, which could then lead to acne, but the actual evidence here is just not that robust. So again, mechanisms do not always lead to outcomes. Biology just isn't that straightforward. None of these guidelines recommend diet changes as a main acne treatment because the evidence is just not that strong compared to a lot of other treatments which aren't necessarily prescription medications, so the things I mentioned before, adapalene, benzoyl peroxide, and so on. I did a video about the evidence for food and acne with Dr. Angeli Mato, who is another dermatologist who also specializes in acne. Dr. Barbieri also has a video, and the conclusions are largely the same. There is a lot of individual variation with whether dietary changes can actually help with acne. From the evidence, the two things with the strongest associations, although they are still weak, are firstly, foods with high glycemic load, which are things with carbohydrates that absorb into your blood quickly, and dairy. But what they say about dairy in these two podcasts is a bit weird.
The dermatologist, who also happens to know a lot about nutrition, they told me something very interesting. Non-fat and low-fat dairy has emulsifiers. This is actually based on work, I believe, some of which was done at Stanford, that can spike insulin more than full-fat dairy.
There's this misconception that dairy causes acne. It's not so much whole-fat dairy products, but skim and non-fat dairy products. In the United States, there's an emulsifier that's put in non-fat or skim products to give the same mouthfeel as full fat, so people feel like they're getting the same without the calories. And that has a glycemic response.
The idea that there's an emulsifier in US low-fat dairy that causes acne, I asked both of the acne dermatologists and neither of them had heard of this. There are quite a few studies that found increased acne with dairy and not just low-fat dairy, and some of these were done outside the US. So blaming an emulsifier that is in low-fat dairy doesn't really make much sense. There are even studies outside of the US that specifically found more acne with low-fat dairy. There is one from Italy, for example. There are just plenty of more plausible mechanisms for why dairy could lead to acne and why low-fat dairy could be worse. So, for example, there might be something fat-soluble in milk that could counteract acne. I think we have now come to the section that has the highest density of weird claims for me. It is this bit about hair.
Shampoos tend to have things that strip oils as a mechanism of cleaning. So when you take a cross-section of the hair, there's 7 layers. The layer that provides that color, sheen, and structure is called the cuticle. As we age, we lose the cuticle, and that's a common problem, what we see in male and female pattern hair loss or androgenetic alopecia, is we lose that cuticle, which makes us lose the shine and the structure and the strength of our hair.
So let's start with the hair structure issues. There are not 7 layers in hair. I found a dermatology textbook that says there are 7 layers in the hair follicle, which is the bit that is still inside your scalp, but only 3 of these layers are in your hair shaft, which is what is out of your scalp. That is the bit that we are using shampoos on. The cuticle is the outside layer, and yes, it is responsible for sheen, but color is the cortex inside. The structure is also almost entirely about the cortex. We do not lose the cuticle as we age. I could not find where the hell this comes from. I think it is mostly just him. I think maybe he thinks that the color is in the cuticle, so when your hair goes gray, you are losing the whole of that outside cuticle layer. But gray hair actually has the same layers as other hair. It is pretty much the same as regular hair, except that you have less melanin, which is the pigment. That is a very minor part of the cortex. You also do not lose the cuticle with androgenetic alopecia, which is male and female pattern hair loss. This is when hormones are turning terminal hairs, which are the thicker types of hair that you see on your head, into miniaturized vellus hair, which is the type of hair that you have on your arms and legs. So it is obviously a lot shorter and a lot thinner. They do have less cuticle and less cortex, but they still have them. They aren't like damaged hair. They are actually a completely different type of hair.
We lose that cuticle, which makes us lose the shine and the structure and the strength of our hair. Our body tries to replenish that with the oils. So when people wash their hair, sometimes they feel like their hair becomes more limp or dull or lifeless. It's because we've taken that artificial oil coating that replaced the cuticle and washed it off.
Our body does not try to replenish the cuticle with oils. Again, I have no idea where this comes from. My best guess is that he might have mixed up a bunch of common ideas about hair into one big mess. So first off, the idea of rebound oil or hair training. This is the idea that your scalp produces more oil to try to replenish that stuff that you washed off. So if you don't wash your hair, for example, then it will end up getting less greasy because your scalp learns to not put out as much oil. This is not true. There is no mechanism where your scalp can actually sense how much oil is already on your hair or your scalp and then adjust. What I think is more likely is that you are just getting more used to the level of oil. After a while, it's just bothering you less. But some people are just oily. The amount of oil you put out is controlled by hormones and genetics. So some people are just going to need to wash their hair more. Number 2 is the fact that scalp oil or sebum does coat the hair, and that is also what conditioner does, but having too much sebum or artificial oil coating, as he calls it, that actually makes your hair more limp and dull and lifeless. It weighs your hair down. If you use a conditioner that is too conditioning for your hair, that will also weigh it down. So if you have this problem, shampoo is actually the solution. It gets rid of the oil and stuff, and your hair is less weighed down. It can be springier. Shampoo is fine. It doesn't cause damage. It is not causing male pattern hair loss. It actually helps with a lot of issues like scalp inflammation and dandruff. There are these microorganisms on your scalp called malassezia, and they feed off oil and turn it into irritating fatty acids. And these can lead to irritation and dandruff, and that can actually make hair loss worse, including male pattern hair loss. So shampoos, by removing the oil, that food source, that will actually help control the yeast and keep it in check. So at the end of all of that, what have we learned? Look, I think Andrew Huberman is a really talented science communicator. He's gotten a massive audience who really trusts him because he is great at simplifying complex stuff and turning it into credible sounding advice that you can integrate into your life. But I already knew a lot of the science behind what they covered, and I feel like these 2 episodes were just a massive disservice to his audience. From what I've seen other scientists say when he covers their areas of expertise, this is not the first time. I hope some of the people who did trust the advice in those skincare episodes will see this video. I know it is not going to get the same reach as Huberman, but I had to try. He does make some good points, and there is a lot in there that is accurate, but there's also a lot of incorrect information, especially with the actual actionable advice. Some really evidence-backed, inexpensive, low-effort, easy to integrate advice just barely got mentioned, and then a lot of expensive, not very well supported things that are not likely to be successful were really overemphasized. I don't know if it's because he tries to cover so many topics, so he just doesn't have time to properly read the papers that he's citing or vet his experts properly, but from these 2 episodes, it really feels like he is trusting the wrong people, or it might just be the nature of this whole podcast ecosystem. People who have a product to sell will go on lots of podcasts to try to market their product, and then they might start off with good intentions, but after a while, maybe they've just repeated their own marketing so much that it is just really integrated into their minds, and they are not really being objective about the actual entire body of evidence anymore. And it is just really disappointing to me that a Stanford neuroscientist who seems to be a pretty smart guy, he knows how to critically assess science, he doesn't seem to have a very high level of quality control here. It's not as bad as Joe Rogan or Diary of a CEO or someone else who isn't a scientist, but I don't think it is a massive ask to maybe have him check the person's area of expertise and stay within it. Maybe ask other dermatologists what this specific dermatologist knows really well. Things like Mohs surgery and advances in skin cancer treatments are actually super cool, and they are barely talked about. Maybe don't release 2 hours of content every week. Maybe 1 hour of higher quality content would be more valuable. I don't think Huberman is really struggling for money. Half the length, half the ads is not going to massively hamper his quality of life. But most of his audience probably don't have the same money to spend on stuff that probably doesn't work. It could make a massive difference. There were a few sunscreen safety things that I wanted to talk about earlier, but I didn't know enough. But before that, thank you for sticking around, and well done, like and subscribe. This is unusually long, I promise. I'm not going to turn into one of those YouTubers who puts out a 3-hour video every 6 months. My next video is going to be sooner and shorter, unless there's another skincare podcast episode. I know what you're thinking. I am not going to do a full breakdown of that podcast with the no longer board certified toxicologist. I might go over some of the short myths for that, but I am not knowledgeable enough about toxicology to really explain it in detail. The person you want for that is Mo Skin Lab. He is a toxicologist and risk assessor. He was actually kind enough to record some answers for me about those sunscreen safety things. The first one is about sunscreens for babies. The dermatologist says something super weird about how baby skin is like a mucous membrane, and I am pretty sure he meant human babies, not like baby frogs. The other thing is something Huberman mentioned in the first episode about being able to taste chemical sunscreens right after you apply them.
Children's skin, particularly infants and toddlers, behaves more like mucous membranes than adult skin. Their barrier is not as tightly woven, so they absorb these things at a much higher concentration. So if you are to apply something on kids, especially young kids 6 months or under, we recommend minerals to begin with.
Another inaccuracy here. This would pose a significant challenge for survival if their skin were actually behaving like a mucous membrane. So now let's have a deeper dive on what these recommendations are based on. First, we have skin development. When a baby is born at a full term, not prematurely, the skin possesses all the structure of an adult's skin. Studies show that infant skin barrier have adult-like properties with full developed stratum corneum. Second, body surface area to body weight ratio. Another factor driving the recommendation is a feature unique to infants and toddlers. Imagine a small sponge weighing 10 grams and another larger sponge weighing around 100 grams. If both sponges are dipped into a glass containing 5 grams of water, each will absorb the water completely. However, the small sponge takes up 50% of its weight, while the larger sponge absorbs only 5%. Due to the rapid changes in ratio during the baby's first year, this accounts for a level of uncertainty that is not tolerated for a product that are formulated to infants and toddlers. The third point is toxikinetics. It describes how the body processes chemicals. Babies are very different from adults, and due to the lack of data on sunscreen filters in populations like infants, avoidance is actually recommended. This avoidance is a highly conservative approach, not because these ingredients are dangerous, as some might suggest. In full-term babies under 1 year, metabolic function in the skin and liver are still very underdeveloped. Point number 4 is increased risk of allergic reaction due to the underdeveloped state of their immune system. This immaturity affects both the quantity and functionality of immune response, especially in the production and activity of T cells, which are essential for immune regulation and allergic tolerance. Sunscreen, whether chemical or mineral, are a part of a full formulation that include solvents, emulsifiers, preservatives, and more. Avoiding unnecessary exposure during this early stage of baby's life is really important.
And in fact, for young kids, particularly those 6 months and under, the American Academy of Dermatology and the American Academy of Pediatrics generally recommends avoiding chemical sunscreens.
Avoiding is a big word, and this is actually inaccurate. Both the American Academy of Dermatology and the American Academy of Pediatrics actually recommend avoiding all sunscreen for kids under 6 months. And when they mentioned any type of preference, they focused on skin irritation, not safety of UV filters.
People talk about how the fact when they apply these sunscreens, they can taste them in their mouth. There's a lot of fear around these, and some of that fear is substantiated.
Ever notice that when you put sunscreen on, a few minutes later, you have that weird chemical taste in your mouth? That baffled enough people that a lot of us have thought, is this being absorbed through my skin into my bloodstream and reaching my taste buds? Well, let's hope not, because thankfully it is highly unlikely. While it isn't entirely known what exactly explains this phenomena, there are far better theories. Theory number 1, I called it the nose knows. The nose is in the center of your face for a reason, allowing easy access for sunscreen to get a little too intimate. Sunscreens contain compounds that can volatilize. These airborne molecules can be inhaled and detected by your olfactory system, your sense of smell. It creates an illusion of tasting something without ingesting it. Think about how when you have a cold and your nose is blocked, foods taste bland. Another theory is airborne particle during application. This happens especially with sprays and lighter lotions. Tiny droplets of the formulation can be inhaled or accidentally get into your mouth. It's similar of how you might catch a whiff and a taste of a perfume or a cologne when someone nearby applies it. A simpler theory is accidental ingestion. Trust me when I say it is easily forgotten how frequently an individual touches their face and mouth. You apply sunscreen with your hands and forget to wash them properly, proceeding to touch your lips or eat something. And back to the original fear-based theory. Why skin absorption is not the cause. They form a protective layer using film-forming ingredients that hold everything together. While some compounds can slowly penetrate the skin barrier, this takes hours, not mere minutes.
Mo is fantastic. I highly recommend following him on YouTube and Instagram. He tackles a lot of those really tricky toxicology myths that no one else really answers properly. His full sunscreen answers are on my secondary channel. The EcoWell also just did a podcast breaking down the Shanna Swan Huberman episode. Yvonne Burkhardt seems to get a lot of her talking points from Shanna. Check out this playlist if you want more of the actual science behind hair care and skincare.